After rounding the Horn and disembarking at Punta Arenas, we started our northward trip, which turned out to be extremely varied and absolutely fascinating. Our travel agent had arranged a car with driver and interpreter to take us the 80 miles north from Punta Arenas to Puerto Natales. By the roadside we saw some rheas. Dan had often seen the word rhea as a crossword clue, so it was interesting to see the birds in the wild. We made a brief stop for a cup of coffee. The prairie-like country seemed very empty, and the sky seemed very big. It seems that the female rheas lay their eggs, then leave the male birds to bring up the family. We even saw some flamingos. Apparently, this part of the border with Argentina is still mined, dating back to the tensions between Chile and Argentina at the time of the generals in the Falklands War. We got our first glimpse of guanaco. There are numerous families of this llama-like animal throughout southern Chile. We had not realized how colourful the ibis can be. On reaching Puerto Natales, we checked into the rather strange Indigo Hotel. We were rather fascinated by it. The next day was reserved for the tour of one of Chile's most important national parks, known as the Torres del Paine. We had never heard of it, and we were simply following the travel agent's recommendation. It turned out to be an extremely worthwhile visit. We were in a small bus carrying about 20 people, and our first stop was at the Cave of Melodon. The bus took us further north towards the mountains. Suddenly, the bus pulled over because the driver had spotted a group of condor. As we got closer, we realized that they were just finishing stripping the carcass of some animal, possibly a sheep. Through the bus window, we got our first glimpse of the towers. Luckily, the cloud was just above the tops. In a couple of places, the bus stopped to let us get out and stretch our legs and take photographs. Gradually, as we closed in on the mountains, the sheer scale and grandeur of this mountain group was impressed upon us. There were several families of guanaco about. Often one animal would be slightly separate from the rest, standing on a vantage point where apparently it was the lookout for puma. It was sad to see the severe damage that had been caused by the bushfire a couple of years previously. This was extensive and has clearly adversely affected both the park and its wildlife, and will take some years to recover. There was a stop so that some passengers could go and visit a glacier, but it was some way away from the bus, and we decided that the walk would be too much. As we returned to Puerto Natales, we were told that the boarding time for the ship had been advanced, so we rushed back to pack our things and check out of the hotel. Passengers were expected to walk to the ship, a distance of several hundred yards, but when we pointed out that this would be difficult for Dan, she was allowed to travel in the baggage vehicle, and I sat on top of the baggage in the back, and we were delivered direct to the car deck. Our ship was the Evangelistas, a fairly old roro ferry to which a limited amount of passenger accommodation had been added. This was to be our home for the next 4 days during our 800-mile trip through the Patagoinian Channels. It was dark when the ship left Puerto Natales and headed southwest across the Golfo Almirante Montt. Next morning, the ship slowed as it approached the Narrows, which apparently would be the narrowest passage that the vessel would make in the entire voyage. It was certainly a fascinating bit of pilotage to watch. In this area, it rains on about 270 days a year, which can make viewing the scenery frustrating. Glimpses of the peaks through the clouds can be very dramatic. All the passengers could fit into the rather small canteen area for the safety briefing from the captain. Many of the passengers were backpackers. They were a fascinating bunch to talk to. The sky gradually lifted as we made our way northward. On the ship, the passengers were welcome on the bridge during daylight hours, providing the ship was not manoeuvring in a small space. The ship made a diversion to visit the Glacier. This chart is typical of many that we saw on the bridge. The number of soundings is quite limited, indicating that the area has not been fully surveyed. This shows the fjord at the bottom of the glacier, which is to the right of the chart. There was not a great deal of room to manoeuvre, and the captain took personal control of the ship, which manoeuvred right up to the base of the glacier. The ship continued on its way northward. At several locations in the ship, screens like this one gave the position, course and speed. As I had lost my camera-fitted GPS, this was the only way that I could unravel the channels when it came to make this video. I simply photographed the screens several times a day. So far, we had seen no sign of human habitation. The whole area is empty, rugged countryside. Eventually, however, we approached the little community of Puerto Natales. It was to be the only township that we would see during the whole voyage. Briefly, the ship anchored off while passengers and cargo were ferried ashore in large outboard-powered dinghies. Once more, we resumed our northward journey. Within a short period, we came to another narrow and twisty section known as Angosturas Inglesas. This was another area where the pilotage was fascinating. Unfortunately, the rain was fairly heavy during this part of the passage. The channel widened into the Canal Messier, where we saw one of the most extraordinary things. Most of this channel is several hundred meters deep. Then, right in the middle of the wide section is a wrecked ship sitting on top of a rock pinnacle. Apparently there is another ship underneath it. Closeness of our track to the wreck shows how steep-sided the rock pinnacle is. This was one of the more spectacular waterfalls that we saw. For the first time we saw signs of other shipping, though the cruise ships that we saw would be far too big to go through the small channels that we had navigated and would be forced out into the open Pacific instead. We had seen several navigation marks in the channel, but this was the first substantial lighthouse we had seen, though we passed it at a range of a couple of miles. For a few hours we would be in the open sea. Forecasts of waves up to 5 meters turned out to be unfounded, though one or two Swiss passengers found the gentle rolling of the ship uncomfortable. Blue whales have been sighted in this area, but we were not to be lucky, although we did see a very active pod of the much smaller minke whales. For several hours the ship made its way round the headland through the night. By dawn we were well back into the channels. Vegetation was beginning to look a bit more lush and we saw the first signs of fish farms. There was a large flock of Magellanic penguins. Apparently, they're often seen at this location, but nobody knows where the roost is. As the weather had been more benign than forecast, the ship was running slightly ahead of schedule, and the captain announced that he was going to make a small diversion via the Canal Rodriguez in the hope of seeing more wildlife. The cormorants were ever present. A large pod of dolphins came swimming rapidly towards the ship, but for some reason I could not get the camera to autofocus properly. On our starboard side we were beginning to see more of the Andean range. We were now getting much further north, but still had another 100 miles to go while the ship passed between the island of Chiloé and the mainland during the night. The weather was now much clearer and we got some fascinating views of snow-capped peaks on the mainland. Eventually the ship made fast in Puerto Montt, stern to at right angles to the quay, with the bow being attached to a buoy. We were met directly off the ship by a small minibus with an interpreter. The bus drove through Puerto Montt, which is a busy and bustling town, then on to the much quieter and rather delightful town of Puerto Varas. The trip took about an hour. Our hotel was on the shores of the lake looking across to the impressive Osorno volcano. We had reached the end of that phase of our journey.